Once upon a time, there was a woman named Emily who loved visiting thrift stores. She enjoyed hunting for hidden treasures among the old clothes, dusty books, and forgotten trinkets. One rainy afternoon, while browsing through the racks, she stumbled upon an old photograph tucked away in a faded frame. The picture showed a group of people standing in front of a house, smiling brightly. But something felt strange about it. The smile seemed too wide, almost unnatural, and there was a shadow lurking in the corner that made Emily shiver. Curious, she decided to buy the photograph, thinking it would make a great addition to her collection. Little did she know, this photograph was not just a simple piece of art. It was cursed. Each night, as the moonlight spilled through her window, Emily would hear whispers coming from the photograph. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination, but soon, she noticed something unsettling. The people in the photograph began to change positions. Every morning, she would wake up and find that the group in the photo had shifted. The man in the blue shirt was now next to the woman in the red dress, and the shadow in the corner seemed to grow darker. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but she couldn't resist the urge to keep the photo. It was like it had a hold on her, pulling her closer with every passing day. As the days went by, the changes became more pronounced. The smiles of the people turned into twisted grins, and their eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind, calling her name. "Emily, come play with us," they would say, sending shivers through her body. She tried to ignore them, but the more she did, the more desperate the voices became. One night, she awoke from a deep sleep to find herself standing in front of the photograph, unable to look away. The people in the picture were staring right at her, their eyes filled with an eerie hunger. Suddenly, she felt a cold breeze sweep through her room, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, reaching for her. Panic set in as she realized she was being pulled into the photograph, into their world. Desperate to escape, she grabbed the frame and tried to throw it away, but it felt glued to her hands. The whispers turned into screams, begging her to join them. "Don't leave us, Emily. You belong with us." The sound was deafening, and she felt the walls of her room closing in. Just when she thought she would be swallowed by the darkness, she remembered a story her grandmother told her about cursed objects. The only way to break the curse was to return the object to where it came from. With all her strength, she tore herself away from the photograph and raced out of her house, clutching the frame tightly. The night was dark and filled with shadows, but she didn't look back. She ran through the pouring rain, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get to the thrift store before it was too late. When she finally arrived, the store was closed and the windows were dark. But Emily didn't care. She banged on the door, pleading for someone to let her in. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and an old woman appeared, her eyes glinting with a knowing look. "You've come for the photograph, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and raspy. Emily nodded, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Please, I need to return it. It's cursed." The old woman smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a smile that sent chills down Emily's spine. "You can't just return it. It's already chosen you." With those words, the shadows around Emily began to swirl, and she felt herself being pulled back toward the photograph. The old woman's laughter echoed in her ears as she stumbled backward, desperately trying to escape. But the darkness was too strong. Just as she thought she would be lost forever, she remembered the stories of courage and strength. Gathering all her willpower, she shouted, "I refuse to be part of your world." The shadows hesitated, and for a moment, the whispers grew quiet. With one final push, Emily hurled the photograph as hard as she could into the store, shattering the frame. The glass exploded outward, and the people in the photograph screamed in rage. As the shards of glass fell to the ground, the shadows dissipated, and Emily felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She stood there, breathless and trembling, as the old woman's expression turned to one of fury. "You think you can escape?" she hissed, but Emily didn't wait to hear more. She turned and ran, not stopping until she was safely home. But even after that night, Emily could still feel the lingering presence of the photograph. The whispers had faded, but the haunting memories remained. She had escaped the curse, but she knew that the darkness would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next person to find the cursed photograph. And so, she learned to live with the fear, always glancing over her shoulder, always aware of the shadows that danced in the corners of her room. The photograph was gone, but the curse had left its mark, reminding her that some treasures are better left undiscovered. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The darkness felt alive, and she knew that the story wasn't truly over. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that the cursed photograph might not be the only object with a dark past. Emily closed her eyes, trying to block out the fear, but the whispers returned, soft and sinister. "You can't escape us, Emily. We're always here." And with that, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the shadows creeping closer, waiting for the moment when she would awaken once more to face the darkness that would never truly let her go. Emily lay wide awake, her heart pounding, as she felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest. Shadows danced along the walls, teasing her with their forms. Each creak of the old house sent jolts of fear through her body, reminding her of that cursed photograph and the sinister forces she had tried to escape. As the clock ticked late into the night, she realized that sleep would not come easily. She could almost hear the whispers again, faint but persistent, like a breeze rustling through the leaves. "Emily, come play with us." The words curled around her, tightening like a noose, and she sat up, her breath quickening. It felt impossible to ignore. The air was charged with an unnatural energy, as if something unseen was waiting for her to make a move. Feeling a strange urge to confront her fears, Emily swung her legs out of bed and stepped onto the cold floor. A chill shot up her spine, and she shivered. The house was often filled with echoes of old memories, but tonight it was different. The air felt thick and heavy, almost alive. As she stepped into the hallway, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. She felt driven to check the living room, where the photograph had once hung. As she walked closer, the lights in her home began to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to writhe and twist along the walls. Every time the light dimmed, she could have sworn she saw brief flashes of movement. It was as if figures were darting in and out of the shadows, watching her with those grinning faces from the photograph. The living room was dark, and as she flipped the switch, the lights struggled to stay bright. Just then, she noticed something unusual. The wall where the photograph had been was marked with strange, swirling patterns that looked like claw marks, deep and jagged, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. Emily's heart raced as she stepped closer to inspect it. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. She ran her fingers over one of the marks, and a sudden chill raced through her. In that moment, she felt a presence behind her, cold and malevolent. The room seemed to grow darker, heavier, as if the air had thickened. It felt like being plunged into icy water. Without warning, the light flickered once more and went out, leaving Emily plunged into total darkness. Panic soared in her chest, and she stumbled backward, colliding with the coffee table. As she tried to regain her balance, she heard a whisper right next to her ear, a cold breath that sent ice through her veins. "You can't run from us, Emily." Her heart raced as she scrambled for her phone, the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. The screen illuminated the room in a soft glow, revealing the horrors that lurked just beyond the light. There, standing not too far from her, were the smiling faces from the photograph, their eyes glowing with an unsettling light. They weren't just shadows. They were there, their bodies distorted and twisted, grinning at her with teeth too sharp to be human. Terrified, she stumbled back toward the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the moment she turned her back, the grinning figures seemed to flicker, melting into the shadows. The whispers grew louder, echoing around her. "Join us, Emily. You belong with us." She ran, desperate to escape, hearing her own footsteps growing muted, swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. As she dashed through her house, she could feel the very walls closing in, the shadows stretching toward her with eager fingers. Just when she thought she was safe, she felt a cold grip on her arm, jolting her heart. She swung around, prepared to fight, but there was nothing to see. The shadows laughed. She could hear it, a low, mocking sound that filled the air, making her skin crawl. In a flash, images raced through her mind. The photograph, the thrift store, the curse that had entwined itself around her life. Then, without warning, one of the figures lunged from the shadows. It was so fast. It grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her into the darkness, dragging her toward the living room where the cursed photograph had once been. Emily screamed, a desperate, piercing sound that echoed as she felt herself slipping away into a void. Suddenly, she remembered something her grandmother had said about dark spirits. They thrived on fear. Summoning every ounce of courage, she shouted back, "I am not afraid of you." The grip on her wrist faltered for just a moment, as if the shadows were surprised by her declaration. Racing back to her feet, she clung to her phone like a lifeline and dashed toward the front door. The shadows swirled around her, trying desperately to hold her back, their voices rising in anger. "You can't leave. You belong with us." Each step toward the door felt like wading through thick mud. It took every bit of strength to keep pushing forward, ignoring the cold that wrapped around her, seeking to draw her back into despair. Just as she reached the front door, it slammed shut with a thunderous bang, shaking the walls of her home. Emily paused, fear clawing at her throat. With trembling hands, she turned the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Panicked, she threw herself against the door, pressing her entire weight against it. But the shadows were relentless. They surged around her like a living entity, whispering promises of dark delights and eternal companionship if she simply surrendered. Then something unexpected happened. The door behind her cracked open slightly, as if inviting her to escape. She hesitated, sensing a trap, but the pressure from the shadows intensified. It felt like a choice between freedom in the unknown and chains in the darkness. In that split second, she decided to leap through the narrow opening. The escape was sudden, and she tumbled out into the night, her heart racing as she fell onto the wet grass outside. She gasped for breath, relief flooding her senses. But behind her, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the shadows trapped inside, for now. But the night was far from safe. As she lay on the damp grass, breathing heavily, she felt a presence watching her, a weight of lingering darkness in the air. What had her escape truly cost? Suddenly, a chilling breeze swept through the yard, and a dense fog began to roll in, enveloping her in its cold embrace. Shapes appeared in the mist, more figures from the photograph, creeping closer with every heartbeat. "You can't escape forever, Emily," their voices called. Each word dripped in a haunting sweetness that lingered in the cold air. The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped dramatically. She could see her breath as she stood up, backing away slowly. Images of twisted faces, arms stretching out and beckoning her, swirled through the supernatural haze. Each figure held the same manic smile she remembered, their eyes glistening with an unnatural light. Emily turned and ran toward the street, but the darkness seemed to follow her, like an unshakable ghost. The whispers grew louder, enveloping her like a cacophony of madness. "You're one of us now, Emily!" The figures in the fog began to dissolve into shadow, only to reform around her, shifting in constant motion, as if they were taunting her escape. With every step, she felt them tugging at her, trying to pull her back into their twisted realm. She faced the weight of the choice she had made. Returning the cursed photograph might have released her from its immediate grasp, but it hadn't freed her from the one scruple that shadowed her every move now. The curse was not just on the object, but could latch onto her soul. As Emily ran, desperation fueled her legs. The fog began to dissipate slightly, revealing the outlines of houses nearby, their lonely windows glowing softly in the dark. If she could just reach someone, maybe they could help her. The thought brought a glimmer of hope, but the darkness ripple behind her only intensified. Fingers brushed against her hair as she raced by, and a laugh, soft yet sinister, echoed in the night. "You can't hide from us," it taunted. Dread filled her chest as she whipped around in fear, but the street was empty. Determined, she dashed toward the nearest house, banging on the door with raw urgency. "Please, help me," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. She was met with silence, the shadows looming closer behind her, ever hungry. But as she turned again, a figure stepped out from behind the trees nearby. An elderly woman, her hair wild and unkempt, stared at her with a knowing look that sent chills coursing through Emily once more. "You shouldn't have taken it," the woman warned, her voice low and echoing. "You brought the curse into your life." Emily's heart dropped. "What do you mean? I thought returning it would help." The woman shook her head. "The curse doesn't end with a mere object. It attaches to the soul, feeding on your fear, your regrets. You're in deeper danger now than before." As those words sank in, Emily felt the weight of darker shadows closing in around her, the cold clawing at her spirit. "No, no, please," she whimpered as the grinning faces crept closer, their laughter echoing hauntingly in the night air. She realized she had been running from more than just the cold. She was running from herself. Before she could respond, the figures lunged towards her, their hands reaching through the dark, seeking to capture her once and for all. With a final scream, Emily dashed away from the old woman, feeling the cold fingers of despair grasp at her heels. But she was done running. If this curse wanted her, it would have to face her head on. Emily squared her shoulders, adrenaline surging through her veins as she faced the gathering shadows. They hissed and laughed, their grins impossibly wide, reminding her of jagged nightmares clawing at her thoughts. Fear became fuel, igniting a defiance she never knew she had. "Come and get me, then," she shouted, her voice trembling yet fierce. With a swift kick, she aimed for the thick fog swirling at her feet, desperate to break through the grip of darkness. As if sensing her sudden resolve, the shadows shrieked, their chorus of whispers turning vehement and frenzied. The air thickened, pregnant with menace, and Emily felt the temperature drop even lower. She felt a shiver snake down her spine, the shadows pulsing like a living entity, hungry for her spirit. Gone was the safety of her home. The world around her transformed into an unrecognizable realm, where reality twisted and turned, blending dreams with nightmares. She darted down the narrow street, heart pounding. Houses loomed on either side, their windows like empty, soulless eyes watching her frantic flight. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself conspired to pull her down, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air, clinging to her like a second skin. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping, echoing in the distance. It seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Curiosity mixed with dread, and against her better judgment, she turned towards the sound. It came from an abandoned house, the front door slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. The wooden porch creaked under her weight as she stepped closer, the door swinging open with a slow, eerie groan. Inside, shadows danced in the flickering light of broken chandeliers, revealing fragments of a forgotten life. Dust-covered furniture lay strewn about, and cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains. The smell of mildew and something rotten permeated the air, filling her with a sense of unease. As she ventured deeper, her footsteps echoed, creating a symphony of sound in the suffocating silence. Suddenly, the thumping grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the walls. She followed the sound down a long, dark hallway, the wallpaper peeling away, its patterns grotesque and fading like memories lost. A pale light flickered at the end, casting elongated shadows that twisted and warped, as if alive. As she approached, the light highlighted a door with strange symbols etched into the wood, glowing faintly like embers. The rhythmic thumping seemed to pulse through the door itself, almost like a heartbeat. Hesitantly, she reached for the knob, feeling an electric jolt travel through her fingers. With a deep breath, she twisted the handle and pushed the door open. What lay beyond shocked her to her core. The room was an altar, stained with dark red, upholstery covered in faded photographs similar to the cursed picture she had once found. They depicted blank-faced figures trapped in moments of eerie joy. At the center sat a wooden chair, its surface marred by deep scratches, and on it, an old, dusty doll, its one eye missing, stared back with an unsettling familiarity. "Welcome back," a voice echoed, resonating from the four walls, rich with malice and familiarity. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the voice from her childhood. A voice that had sung her lullabies and told stories of brave souls. Her grandmother. "You've been chosen, Emily," the voice continued, sweet yet tainted. "You released them by bringing back the photograph. Now, they're free to roam, and you're a part of us." Emily stumbled backward, her skin crawling as the shadows slinked closer, merging with the darkness of the room. Faces appeared, shifting in and out of the light, their mouths moving, but no sound came. They watched her with eyes filled with dread and sorrow, distorted reflections of her own fear. "No," she shouted, feeling the walls close in. "I don't want any part of this." The shadows cackled, their laughter echoing like a chilling chorus of lost souls, each wave pushing her deeper into the room, toward the noose of her past she thought she had escaped. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed movement, a figure emerging from the darkness. It stumbled, dragging what appeared to be chains, the metal scraping harshly against the floor. It wore a tattered gown, and as it stepped into the light, Emily gasped. It was a girl, her face pale, eyes wide with terror, and filled with an unyielding sadness. "Help me," she whispered, her voice cracked like glass. "They won't let me go. You have to escape before it's too late." Emily felt a chill creep into her bones. The girl resembled the ones from the photos, locked in eternal grins. "What do I do?" she asked, fear tightening around her throat like a vice. "Find the heart," the girl urged, glancing anxiously at the shadows creeping closer. "They need it to gain power. Without it, you could break the curse. You must, before they feast upon your fears." Just then, the room shook violently, the floor trembling as if the house itself was reacting to the girl's warning. The shadows hissed, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes, their laughter becoming a furious storm of rage. "Run!" the girl cried out, her face a mask of terror. "Now!" Without thinking, Emily spun on her heel and raced through the doorway, the whispers chasing her, clawing at her mind. She rushed through the hallway, desperate to escape the eerie room behind her. The thumping sound echoed louder, pulsating like a war drum, urging her forward. She burst through the front door just as it slammed shut behind her, the shadows caging themselves within. Stumbling onto the porch, she felt a surge of clarity amidst the madness. The search for the heart, the key to her freedom, began now. Determination fueled her movements as she darted from house to house, the fog swirling ominously around her. Each door she approached seemed to mock her, whispering secrets she couldn't understand. An old, crumbling church caught her eye, its steeple reaching into the stormy sky as if trying to touch the heavens. She hesitated for a moment, the foreboding presence settling in her bones, but she had no other choice. Inside, the atmosphere changed. The air was thick with stale incense and lingering grief. Shadows flickered across the walls, casting eerie shapes that danced as if alive. At the altar, a crimson cloth lay draped over a pedestal, and at its center was a gnarled object, a human heart, preserved in an elaborate glass case, pulsing softly, throbbing in time with the sound of a racing heart. As she approached, a guttural growl resonated from the shadows behind her. The figures that had pursued her manifested once more, gliding toward her with hunger in their eyes. Time slowed, and she could almost feel their breath, cold and rancid, on her neck. "You are OURS," they howled, a cacophony of voices combining into one horrific roar. The shadows surged like a tidal wave, overtaking her as she summoned every ounce of willpower against the darkness. Grabbing the heart, she felt its warm pulse against her skin, a fleeting reminder of life amidst the encroaching death. The moment she touched it, the shadows screamed, twisting and contorting in agony. "No, you cannot take it. You belong to us," they cried, frustration rippling through their forms. Emily clenched the heart tightly, her vision narrowing on the exit. She dashed toward the door, the shadows clawing at her in anger. It felt like the end of a nightmare as she sprinted out, but the moment she crossed the threshold, a blinding light erupted from the heart, illuminating everything around her. The shadows wailed, retreating into the darkness, their grotesque forms disintegrating without the heart's power. Emily flung the heart into the air, watching as it glowed like a star before shattering into countless shards, each glinting fragment releasing echoes of the trapped souls, their anguished cries fading into silence. As the light enveloped her, clarity washed over her. She felt lighter, the weight of the curse lifting. But even then, she could hear whispers lingering in the wind, a promise unbroken, as if she'd merely staved off their hunger. She stood at the edge of the street, dawn approaching on the horizon, light spilling into the world like tears of relief. Yet, as her heart slowed, the memories of their cries haunted her, reaching out like fingers in the fog. "I'll never forget you," she murmured into the fading shadows, knowing deep down that the darkness would always remember her name. And as she turned to leave, the feeling of being watched returned, a gentle, eerie reminder that some shadows never entirely fade away, and the grief of the past continued to linger, waiting for another chance to claim its own. With each step, the world around Emily started to shift. The warm light of dawn dimmed, the sky turning a sickly gray, clouds swirling like a tempest. A gust of wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver through her spine, whispering her name in a tone that felt both familiar and deeply threatening. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder, half hoping to see nothing there. But the sensation curled around her like a dense fog, thick with unnamable dread. Dark figures loomed in the distance, blurred and indistinct, their forms bending and twisting in unnatural ways, merging into the very shadows that remained behind her. Each figure seemed to reach out with long, grasping fingers, stretching towards her, tails of darkness wrapping around them as if they were tethered to something far worse. Just then, a screech pierced the silence, a sound so sharp it cut through the air like broken glass. She froze, heart racing. The noise came again, a blend of a child's wail and something primordial, primal. It echoed off the buildings, wrapping around her like an iron grip. Panic surged through her veins, urging her to run, but she felt rooted. With a deep breath, Emily willed herself to move, pressing forward even as the noise intensified. Her mind raced with thoughts of the girl from the church, the warnings she'd given, visions of what might still linger in that forsaken place. Suddenly, she stumbled upon a narrow alley, an old and crumbling brickway that seemed to draw her in against her will. She hesitated, the hair on her arms standing on end. Shadows dripped from the sides of the buildings, pooling into corners like spilled ink. Against her better judgment, she clutched her sides and stepped in. The air grew colder as she walked, the sound of soft whispers encircling her like a dark cloud. Left behind, they hissed, words crawling under her skin, swirling around her thoughts, mingling with her fears. She pressed on, fighting the urge to scream as scraps of paper fluttered past her feet. They caught her eye, old photographs like the ones from the premonition, faces distorted in terror, a gust of wind giving them life. Emily's breath quickened. Had she reached the heart of their despair? Deep within the alley, she glimpsed a darkened doorway, the opening gaping like a mouth ready to devour her. The whispers became frenzied now, merging into a cacophony of despair, begging for release. She knew she shouldn't go in, yet a compulsion drew her to that foreboding entrance. It felt almost magnetic, as if the shadows were calling out to her. Ignoring her instincts, she stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind her with a resonating thud, shaking the very foundations of the structure. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles placed haphazardly on the floor, their light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her every movement. The walls were adorned with eerily familiar portraits, faces of the lost, eyes following her as she moved, their mouths twisted in silent screams. A chilling draft whispered past her, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. In the corner, a figure loomed, hunched and trembling as if caught between worlds. Emily's heart raced anew, fear washing over her as she leaned in closer. It was the girl from the church, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and longing. "They need you," the girl croaked, her voice scratching at the edges of Emily's sanity, lowering her gaze as if in submission. "You released the heart, but it's not enough. They will come for you. Even now, they are here." In that moment, Emily heard them. The soft shuffle of footsteps, the sound of breath held too long, a rustling that felt alive. Shadows crept along the walls, morphing, taking form. A haunting melody began to hum, blending with the whisper of the wind, an old nursery rhyme twisted into something sinister. The girl clasped her hands, eyes wild with fear. "You must find the others before they arrive. They can smell your fear. They will take you." "No, no!" Emily screamed, her voice echoing back to her, lost in the spinning chaos. "What do I do? What do I need?" "You need to confront what's been left undone," the girl whispered, her tone softening. "Face them and break their hold. Find the echo of the heart, and it will lead you back." Before Emily could respond, the shadows surged, swirling together to form a monstrous figure, towering above her. It was a grotesque amalgamation of the faces she had seen in the photographs, twisting and turning, mouths stretching into impossibly wide grins. Each face seemed to cry out, their ethereal voices blending into a single, inescapable scream. "Join us," it hissed, the air turning frigid, tightening around her throat. "You cannot escape what is yours. We are your past, and we will never let go." With horror gripping her, Emily tore her eyes away and ran deeper into the room, desperate to find a way out, to find the echo of the heart. She stumbled upon an old mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. In its reflection, she didn't just see herself, but the faces of those trapped within the shadows, their eyes glistening with tears unspilled, their mouths forming silent screams for help. They reached out toward her, fingers extended, as though begging her to join them, to give in to the darkness. "No," she screamed, covering her ears, trying to block out the awful cacophony. It was like 1,000 souls trapped in torment, each cry threatening to collapse her psyche. She felt the room closing in again, suffocating her under their weight. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from within the mirror, illuminating every crevice of the room, forcing the shadows to retreat. Emily felt the energy pulse through her, resonating with the heartbeat of the heart she had shattered. She reached for it, envisioning its remnants and using that connection to fuel her fight. The shadows wailed, twisting and turning violently, grasping at the edges of the light that surrounded her. "Don't let it go," they screamed. "You belong to us." As the demon's grip loosened, she felt strength radiating from the remnants of the heart. "You are not my past. You are not my future," Emily declared, the force of her words sending ripples of light cascading outward. The shadows recoiled, morphing into pained faces, a last desperate attempt to cling to her. With one final surge, she pushed the light outward, a wave of energy sweeping through the space, breaking them apart like glass. And with each fragment, she felt herself growing stronger, lighter. But just as hope surged within her, the girl's voice, now honeyed and laced with a venomous edge, rang in her ears. "You cannot banish them for good. They will return. They are eternal, as you now are. Remember, this is only the beginning." Emily's heart sank as darkness clawed its way back, shapes forming from the remnants of her past, figures she had thought long buried. She stood frozen, realizing with terror that this battle was far from over. The shadows were not merely chasing her. They were feeding off her fear, weaving with the fabric of her memories, rewriting her reality thread by thread. The walls of the room began to dissolve, shadows expanding like an endless abyss, drawing her closer to its gaping maw. She swallowed hard, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Everything she feared was there, waiting to reclaim its hold on her soul. And in that moment, she knew the only escape lay in unraveling the truth hidden within. With not a second to waste, she steeled herself and made a choice. It wasn't about escaping, but fighting the language of the shadows. "If you want my soul," she growled, fury igniting within her, "then you'll have to face me." Gathering every ounce of bravery, she shouted, the sound echoing through both trepidation and resolve. Chains rattled in the distance, and the shadows recoiled, as if the very essence of her defiance struck them like lightning. Energized, Emily stepped forward into the darkness, prepared to face the storm brewing inside her, for it was time to confront the horror of her own creation. As she moved deeper into the abyss, the air grew colder, wrapping around her like ice. The flickering lights of the candles faded into nothingness, their warmth extinguished by the encroaching shadows. Whispers filled the void. They wrapped tightly around her, curling in her ears, growing louder, melodic yet twisted. "Turn back," they said, "doom awaits." Each word slithered into her mind, suffocating her resolve, but she pressed on, determined not to be a mere pawn in this dark game. The ground beneath her feet shifted, becoming gooey and malleable as if it were alive, pulling at her shoes like hands demanding she sink into the earth. She stumbled but maintained her balance. Ahead, a dull thumping sound echoed, rhythmic like a heartbeat, filling the silence with a dreadful tempo. It drew her closer like a moth to a flame, and she couldn't help but follow its beckoning pull. The thumping intensified, morphing into a cacophony, more voices rising and falling, each one melding into a chorus of agony. They cried out in sorrow, layering over each other, a haunting hymn that sent chills up her spine. Every step felt heavier, the shadows pressing closer, eager to pull her into their depths. Dark figures danced on the edges of her vision, flickering in and out like the dying embers of a fire. She could see their eyes glinting, almost mocking her as they swirled around her, feeding off her fear. Then she found herself in a vast chamber, the walls slick with moisture, slick with something oily and dark. The ceiling stretched up into an infinite void, where shadows collided and merged, forming shapes that rippled with a life of their own. In the center of the room, a pedestal stood, ancient and gnarled, like a twisted branch ripped from a tree, crowned by a pulsating, dark mass that throbbed with a heartbeat of its own. It was the echo of the heart she had sensed before, throbbing with a rhythm that mirrored her own. An overpowering pull beckoned her toward the heart, as if it resonated with her very soul. Around it, shadows spiraled, twisting and swirling like smoke. As she approached, the air thickened, becoming almost tangible. Each breath she took was labored, filled with the suffocating weight of grief that seemed to rise from the pulsing heart itself. Images flitted across her mind, faces contorted in pain, scenes of loss that replayed like broken film, memories long buried. In that moment, Emily realized these were not just shadows. They were the remnants of those she had lost, the memories of their fears and sorrows clinging to her. The heart pulsed again, louder, and the visions intensified. She could hear their whispers distinctly now, filled with sorrow, each voice a thread tugging at the fabric of her consciousness. "Free us," they begged, "before it's too late." Suddenly, the chamber shook, dust cascading from above. The shadows grew desperate, swirling like a tempest. "Join us," they howled, voices rising to a fever pitch before shifting to guttural roars that filled the room with terror. The figures around the heart grew more distinct, their features twisting into grotesque mimics of the people she had lost. Torn between grief and horror, she couldn't help but let out a scream, her pulse racing, echoing in rhythm with the pulsing heart before her. The shadows lunged toward her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, pulling her closer to despair. She fought against their grip, trying to recall the courage she'd found just moments before, but the darkness began to seep into her thoughts, eroding her resolve. Fear welled up, and just as suddenly, the room twisted and warped, creating illusions of more shadows emerging, piercing shapes that reached for her with unseen fingers. Embrace the darkness, they urged, the voices now a calm caress that tinged her veins with dread. It felt as if they recognized her, knew her weaknesses, and were eager to exploit them. In her mind's eye, she could see the glimpses of her past, the moments of weakness that had shattered her strength. Each memory twisted, showcasing her failures, her fears, the regrets that had built up like a wall around her heart. Desperate to break free, Emily let out a primal scream, one that resonated from deep within, shattering the illusions surrounding her. The chamber rattled violently, and the shadows hesitated for just a moment. She took that moment to focus on the heart, the source of this madness, and stepped closer, determined to confront it. As her hand reached out to touch the dark mass, an explosion of light erupted from within her soul, filling the room with a blinding flash that forced the shadows to recoil. She felt a bond ignite between herself and the heart, a rush of energy surging like electricity. The voices escalated into a chaotic symphony of despair, pleading for her to afford them salvation. "Do not run," they cried. "Do not abandon us. We are your past, your haunts. Without us, you are nothing." "No!" Emily shouted, fire coursing through her veins. "You don't define me." She felt the energy in the heart ripple in response, responding to her defiance. The shadows flinched, twisting as if the force was an infection spreading through their ranks, tearing at the very essence of their being. Gritting her teeth, she channeled every bit of power she had left, pushing against the suffocating air. "Begone!" Emily roared. The command was primal, echoing off the walls as the tendrils of shadow writhed, shrieking in a cacophony of rage. They thrashed violently, losing cohesion, struggling against the light that radiated from her. She could see them fading, dissolving into wisps as the heart pulsed brighter, wrapping her in its warmth. But just as victory felt close, the ground began to tremble beneath her. The shadows erupted into chaos, flailing wildly, and without warning, a dark figure emerged from within the heart, a twisted visage of anguish that bore a haunting resemblance to her darkest self. It was a reflection of everything she feared to become, a monster stitched together from her regrets and failures. With hollow eyes void of light, the dark figure spoke, its voice a chilling mimicry of Emily's own. "You cannot escape me, for I am you. Your fears, your failures, they will always be part of you." The ground cracked, fissures forming and swallowing the ancient pedestal whole. Emily felt herself slipping, tumbling into that endless abyss of despair, all the while staring into the face of her doppelganger. It grinned, a sickening mockery of joy as it reached out, fingers elongating and twisting, as if to beckon her into an everlasting darkness. "No," she shouted, clenching her fists, summoning the last of her strength. "You don't control me." With each word, light erupted from her hands, pouring into the split in the ground, urging the shadows to retreat. The dark figure recoiled as the light blinded it, the edges of its form melting away with a sound like cracking glass. "You can't erase what you are," it screamed, a shrill, echoing voice that reverberated off the walls, drowning out the whispers of the tortured souls around her. With a final push, Emily threw her voice into the heart of darkness. "I will fight. I will reclaim what I've lost." In response, the heart surged with energy, its rhythm matching the beat of her own heart. The shadows shrieked, retreating, dissolving into the cracks of the ground. The dark figure wavered, its expression twisting from malice to despair. "You'll pay for this," it hissed, until it simply shattered into a flurry of dark dust, blown away by a powerful gust that swept through the chamber. With the figure gone, the darkness receded, pulling away into the corners of the room until what remained was a spectral glow, illuminating the lost faces of those caught within the shadows. They no longer writhed in torment. instead looking toward her with expressions of gratitude, their chains of sorrow slowly breaking. The ground settled, a calm washing over her as if a storm had passed. Shadows lingered in the periphery, but now they seemed less menacing, more like a memory fading in the sunlight, and yet she could still feel the creeping cold tightening around her heart. But the victory felt elusive, for she knew they might return. The ache of their presence thrummed against her, whispers still lingering in the edges of her mind. A reminder that the battle with her darkness, the play of memory and regret, was far from over. In her heart, the darkness had ebbed, but beneath the surface lay the promise of a return. She clutched the remnants of the echo deep in her chest, feeling the weight of the past battling against the new light she sought to embrace. It was a fragile flame, flickering but resolved to endure. As Emily turned to leave the chamber, the shadows whispered one last time, "You may fight, but you cannot silence us forever. We will return, and when we do, it will be your reckoning." With those lingering words echoing in her mind, she took her first steps back toward the light, uncertain of what awaited her. She knew one truth: horror was never easily escaped. It lived within, waiting for the moment to pounce. Emily stepped into the tunnel, her heart pounding with each beat echoing through the damp air. The shadows seemed to swirl behind her, alive with their whispered secrets, clawing at her resolve. She could almost hear them gnashing their teeth, angry at their defeat but lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The flickering light from her phone only cast long, shivering shadows against the slick stone walls, deepening the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. Each step felt like a descent into some nightmare, the walls narrowing in on her, closing the space between her and the dark echoes that swirled around. She reached a part of the tunnel where the air grew thick and heavy, smelling of rot and decay, as if the very earth was exhaling its trapped breath. The dim light flickered more violently now, the shadows elongating and shrinking as if they were straining to reach her. Instinctively, she rubbed her arm, trying to shake off the sensation of icy fingers trailing along her skin, reminding her that she was not alone. Suddenly, the whispers escalated into a cacophony, rising and falling like the tide, a tide made of sorrow and rage. Faces began to emerge from the murk, ghostly figures flickering in and out of view, their eyes wide with despair. They opened their mouths in silent screams, faces contorting in anguish. Emily's breath caught in her throat, panic blooming in her chest. "Why are you here?" she gasped, but the spirits didn't respond. Instead, they reached toward her, bony fingers brushing against her skin like a chilling caress. She stumbled backward, the coldness of their touch lingering, leaving a tangible mark that made her shudder. The shadows flickered around her, eager to pull her into their ominous embrace. "You will join us," they chanted, each voice a whisper of death washing over her. The shadows twisted into darker shapes, morphing into monstrous versions of those she had lost, their features grotesque, mouths gaping in silent howls. She turned to run, but the path behind her seemed to shift and contort, stretching endlessly into blackness, trapping her in this nightmare. Then, she caught sight of something moving up ahead, a flicker of warmth amidst the cold darkness. It drew her in like a moth to a flame. Emily began to move toward it, hoping for salvation, for an end to the relentless horror tracking her every step. But as she approached, dread seeped in. The flickering light warped, twisting into something more sinister. It was a door, ancient and ornate, covered in scars and etched with symbols that seemed to shift under her gaze. The wood groaned as she hesitantly pushed it open, the creak echoing like a warning throughout the still air. Inside, a vast room unfolded, but her heart sank as she realized it was a shrine, a grotesque homage to the lost souls of the tunnel. The walls were lined with photographs, faces frozen in time, eyes pleading and hollow. Candles flickered on a makeshift altar strewn with items that belonged to the departed, broken toys, forgotten letters, and fragments of belongings that glimmered with sorrow. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wax and something more acrid, something oppressive that clawed at her throat. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside with a hollow thud. Panic surged through her veins as she spun around, seeking a way out, but the shadows quickly converged, blocking the exit, their forms writhing in frustration. She felt a tingling sensation crawling up her back, and when she turned, the photographs began to quiver, the faces in them twisting into expressions of pure agony, mouths now wide open in real screams, piercing her eardrums and making her stagger backward. Shadows slithered across the floor, rising like smoke, wrapping around her ankles. The whispers turned to shouts now, a symphony of fury. "You shouldn't have come here," they screeched, each syllable laced with venom. The room felt as though it was closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter, a cocoon of despair tightening around her. Emily pressed her back against the altar, trying to block out the cacophony, searching for a glimmer of hope in the building darkness. Then, a figure emerged from among the shadows, clear and solid against the swirling gloom. It was a woman, her features worn and familiar. It was her mother. Emily's heart cracked open, a dual pang of longing and terror bleeding into one another. Her mother's eyes glimmered with tears as she reached out, but something was terribly wrong. The figure was distorted, flickering like a broken signal, and the closer Emily got, the more her mother's face twisted into distorted agony, a mask of pain that spoke of all the suffering she had ever known. "Emily, I need your help," the figure said, her voice echoing with desperation, but Emily could feel the bitterness of dread crawling under her skin. "You brought me here. You have to set us free." The words were a heavy weight that pressed her down, and despite her longing to reach out and hold her mother, the shadows writhed menacingly at the edges of her vision. "Help us," the voices chanted behind her, echoing like a chant, a rhythmic pulsing of dark energy. "Join us, becoming one with despair, with us forever." "No, I won't," Emily shouted, her voice hoarse, rising above the chaos. The lights dimmed, creating a macabre dance of shadows that lunged toward her, drawn by her resistance. The altar behind her trembled, the objects atop it rattling, as if foretelling the doom that awaited her. And then she saw it, that heart embedded in the shadows, pulsing, alive, waiting to ensnare her. "Fight it, Emily," her mother pleaded, the image flickering faster, desperation coating her words. "Don't let them take you. You must break the cycle." In that moment of clarity, Emily felt her fear morph into a burning rage. She was not merely a spectator in this nightmare. She was the storm, and she could wield its power. "I am my own," she yelled defiantly. "You don't control me." With that declaration, a surge of energy erupted from her, the air crackling with heat. The shadows recoiled, fear shimmering in their frantic movements. Emily reached deep within herself, wielding every ounce of strength she had left, igniting the latent power of hope stored deep in her heart. The flames of her courage spread outward, consuming the dark tendrils that gripped her, turning their cold embrace into ash. As the shadows disintegrated into wisps of smoke and the room swirled in luminous light, she felt a shift. The faces on the walls stared in awe and yearning, their silent screams turning into soft whispers of gratitude. "Thank you," they breathed as the oppressive weight that had clung to her began to lift. But in that surge of liberation, she also felt the sharp sting of something slipping away, a gnawing emptiness where fear had been a constant companion. "Emily," her mother cried, the figure flickering ominously, the warmth of familiarity beginning to fade. "No, don't let go." Just as harsh reality formed a noose around her heart, the door rattled behind her, the sound of something heavy scraping against its surface. She turned, heart racing. From the very depths of the darkness, a new horror emerged, a swirling mass that looked like a storm consumed by rage. It twisted into shapes, clawing arms and gaping maws yawning wide, hungry for her soul. The room erupted in chaos as the last remnants of shadows twisted together, forming an immense, monstrous figure with countless eyes that blinked in vicious hunger. "You think you can escape?" It boomed, its voice like thunder, rattling the very ground beneath her feet. "You'll join us, willingly or not." With her heart in her throat, Emily knew what she had to do. The battle was far from over. The path was dark, full of horrors yet to unfold, but she was no longer afraid to face it. She would fight, not just for herself, but for all the lost souls lingering in this wretched place. With determination in her eyes, she clutched the remnants of hope tightly, ready to plunge into the storm once more. In the depths of despair, she would rise, fueled by a fire that darkness could never extinguish. The nightmare awaited, and she would confront it head-on. The monstrous figure loomed, a mass of twisting tendrils shadowed in darkness, its eyes shimmering with predatory hunger. Emily's heart raced, each beat a drum echoing through the vast room. The air thickened with a stale, oppressive energy that choked her, each breath a struggle against an unseen weight pressing down on her. With one devastating sweep of its arm, the creature sent a wave of icy air crashing toward her, freezing her in place. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the remnants of the shrine shuddered, and the scattered belongings began to rattle and slide across the floor. Broken toys rolled toward her, their painted faces distorted in twisted expressions of glee and malice, eyes following her every motion with a haunted life of their own. She could hear them, the muted whispers of the playthings, urging her to join the shadows, promising her eternal play in this realm of despair. Emily. The sound of her name reverberated off the walls, but it wasn't just the creature calling her. Voices filled the air, soft and luring, a cacophony of temptations that clawed at her sanity. "Don't fight it," they urged, each syllable dripping with sweetness that turned bitter in her mouth. "Every soul becomes one of us. You cannot resist your fate." Just as the voices crescendoed into a terrifying symphony, a blast of light erupted from the center of her being, illuminating the darkness. The mass shrieked, the shriek piercing through her ears like a banshee wail, an unholy sound that rattled the very foundation of her resolve. Shadows recoiled, twisting away to form a vortex of anguished faces, all wailing in horror. Terrified, she felt a tug at her mind, an urge to surrender to the void, to let go and embrace the endless night seducing her, but something deeper surged within her, a spark of defiance to fight back. She took a step forward, driven by adrenaline and rage. The altar behind her pulsed, and she could almost hear the hearts of the forgotten souls beating in unison, a rhythm that filled the air with a strange warmth. Gathering her courage, Emily locked her gaze on the creature, her voice trembling yet fierce. "I am not yours to claim." The words hung in the air, a challenge that resonated beyond the shrine walls. For a moment, silence enveloped her. Even the whispers paused, as if the shadows had collectively drawn a breath. But then the creature screeched again, an unnerving mix of fury and pain, and the very floor beneath her began to crack. Dark tendrils lashed out, probing at her feet like snakes seeking warmth, trying to drag her down into the abyss. She jumped back, heart pounding as she swerved toward the back of the shrine, glancing at the faces in the photographs. Their eyes were wide now, pleading, silently begging for her to break the cycle. Nightmares danced around her, but for every dark figure that stalked closer, there was another yearning for release. The tension mounted, the air thick with despair, an unseen force closing in. In a desperate attempt for clarity, Emily closed her eyes. She focused on her breath, on the warmth still radiating within her, a small flicker against the encroaching shadows. When she opened her eyes again, everything felt different. The shadows pulsed in erratic rhythms, and through the chaos, she could see a faint light emerging from the far corner of the room. It flickered softly, a golden glow that pierced through the gloom, illuminating the faces around her with a warm embrace. A narrow path stretched toward it, glimmering as if it were formed from pure hope. But the creature, sensing her shift in direction, lunged forward, its clawed hand slicing through the air, sending a wave of cold that enveloped her, freezing her resolve. "Your light shall dim," it growled, the voice a low rumble that vibrated in her bones. "You will be ours forever." With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily launched herself toward the light, the warmth beckoning her, urging her to break free from the shadow's grasp. The creature followed, howling in rage, its appendages lashing wildly, desperate to reel her back into darkness. As she ran, the world around her exploded into madness. The darkness seemed alive, threatening to close in. She reached the light, and every brilliant ray felt like pure life surging through her veins, electrifying her very existence. As she stepped into the beams of warmth, shadows recoiled, shrieking in agony as if the light burned them. Reality twisted, and the walls of the shrine warped around her, molten waves of darkness crashing against radiant light. Suddenly, she was no longer in that cursed room, but standing in an expanse of blinding white, the air humming with power. Here, the weight of despair lifted, and she could breathe easily, yet the shadows lingered at the edges of this new reality, swirling like smoke, just waiting for a chance to reclaim their hold. They whispered her name again, the sweet lure of darkness mingling with the light, testing her will, bending her resolve. "Join us," they wailed from the periphery, their voices melodic yet chilling. "You belong to the shadows. You cannot change your fate." Fingers trembling, she clutched her heart, feeling the essence of hope still alive within. And then she remembered why she was here, to save them, to free the lost souls that had fallen victim to this hell. What if the only way through was to face the darkness head-on? The thought settled deep within her, entwined with a newfound strength. Taking a deep breath, she centered herself. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadows paused, their whispers faltering, strengthened by her defiance. Emily began to push back, pouring her will into the light surrounding her, fueling it with the grief and rage from all that had been taken. The energy surged wildly, gleaming brighter and brighter, until it erupted like a supernova, casting the remaining darkness back into itself with explosive force. The shadows writhed and convulsed, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes, and shrieks filled the air, an eerie harmony of chaos. "No," they howled, the creature's voice rising above the tumult. "You cannot fight fate." But Emily closed her eyes again, feeling the light envelop her, and summoned every ounce of love she had for those lost within the void. She stood firm, even as darkness clawed at her heels, its whispered threats growing fainter, retreating from the brilliance that filled her heart. The light expanded outward, and she felt the warmth of her mother alongside her, not as a ghost, but as a source of strength guiding her through the chaos. Together, they charged the darkness, the boundary between light and shadow blurring as the creature's form quaked in fear. With a final surge, she thrust her hands forward, and as if answering a long-forgotten call, the very fabric of the shadow realm began to unravel, threads of despair snapping like frayed ropes. The dark appendages wriggled and retreated, howling in anguish as they disintegrated into dust, swirling away like ash in the wind. Breathless, Emily opened her eyes to find herself back in the shrine, yet everything felt different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by an ethereal glow that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, soothing everything it touched. The faces in the photographs began to brighten, the air filling with whispers of gratitude and release. And yet, she noticed something lurking in the corners of her vision, remnants of shadows still snaking around the edges. But now, they seemed less threatening, almost subdued. Emily took a step forward, toward the altar where the remnants of despair had once reigned. "Are you free?" she called out into the stillness, her voice steady, uncertainty cloaking her. The room fell silent, and one by one, the shadows shifted, forming clearer shapes. No longer monstrous, they started to resemble familiar faces, the pain in their eyes replaced with quiet recognition. "We are," they murmured, a collective sigh of relief escaping the depths of their souls. "You have freed us," but before they could finish, the ground trembled again, and she felt the air shift, something dark and ancient stirring beneath her feet. The creature's presence lingered, a low growl vibrating through the floorboards like thunder, a reminder that although she had won this battle, the war was far from over. "Do not be fooled," the whispers grew louder, swirling through the room, threatening to engulf her again. "The darkness is patient. It will always return. You are the flame, but flames are easily snuffed out." As the shadows coiled and transformed back into a swirling mass, Emily stood her ground, the fire of defiance igniting in her core. "Not this time," she shouted, her voice ringing clear in the fading dusk, echoing through the chamber filled with lost souls. The room responded to her defiance. The shadows faltered, slithering backward, momentarily stunned by her bravery. Yet, the darkness was relentless, a living entity that surged forward, swirling like a tempest. It lashed out, engulfing Emily in a cold shroud that threatened to suffocate her. She felt whispers claw at her mind, each word sizzling like acid against her thoughts. "Embrace us," they hissed, a dozen voices woven into one, seductive yet ghastly. "Join us, and the pain will cease." The walls of the shrine warped and pulsed, morphing into grotesque faces that reached out with twisted fingers, their eyes wide with silent screams. Emily shut her eyes tightly, forcing the warmth of hope to fill her chest, but the oppressive chill crept deeper. She opened her eyes to see the shadows coalescing, forming grotesque shapes, their features distorted in agony as they reached toward her, as if begging her to join them in their torment. She took a step back, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but there was nowhere to run. This was her battleground. The darkness had no intention of letting her leave. It seeped into every corner, darting through the cracks in reality, whispering promises of release from pain. "Why fight?" it taunted, the shadows swirling with each syllable. "You are stronger together. Just let go." Emily's heart raced as she drew in a breath, grounding herself in the memories of those who had suffered. She thought of their faces, their silent burdens, their cries for help. She was the beacon of hope for those lost. The world around her continued to shift, the ceilings bending and the floor rippling like a lake disturbed, reflections of nightmares flashing before her. Suddenly, one of the photographs on the wall shattered, sending shards raining down like fragile stars, glinting ominously in the faint light. A silhouette emerged from the shards, a figure cloaked in shadows but pulsating with a flickering light. With every beat, it grew more defined, stepping closer, a wraith rising from the remnants of despair. Emily gasped, recognizing the anguished face of one of the lost souls, her eyes wide and pleading, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Help me!" the apparition wailed, reaching out with trembling hands, fingers stretching toward Emily. "She won't let me go. I am trapped in this torment." Emily felt the palpable agony radiating from the figure, a weight that pressed down on her chest. The shadows stirred, responding with a collective hiss, snapping back into formation around the ghost. "Leave her," they howled, their voices a chaotic blend of wrath and despair. "She is ours. You cannot help the damned." With a surge of determination, Emily thrust her hands forward, feeling a warmth igniting within her, fueled by every soul that had suffered alongside this spirit. "You are not alone," she cried out, the words resonating with the light inside her. "You can be free." Light erupted from her palms, spilling outwards in brilliant waves, momentarily pushing the darkness back. The figure paused, hope sparking in her hollow gaze. But the creature lurking in the shadows recoiled, anger radiated from its monstrous form, swirling like a storm contained. "Foolish girl," it screeched, the voice reverberating through the shrine, tails of shadows writhing around its funnel-like body. "You think your light can save them? You think kindness will triumph over darkness? They are mine, and I will have them back." As the creature lunged forward, a flicker of light caught Emily's eye, the glint of glass scattered on the floor, reflecting the warmth she projected. In a moment of desperation, her mind raced. If I can shine bright for them, for all of them, she thought, then maybe together we can break this curse. Gritting her teeth, she envisioned each soul, all those trapped in anguish, all those yearning for the light. "Stand with me," she shouted, calling out not only to the souls before her, but to the shadows that entwined around them. "Together, we will fight. You belong to the light." The darkness shrieked, twisted faces contorting in rage, the crescendo echoing in her ears like a tempest. It thrashed wildly, attempting to envelop her in its icy grip, but Emily held firm. She charged forward, focusing her energy as the spectral light intensified, transforming the cool glow into a blinding beacon of warmth. With a final surge, she slammed her hands against the altar, feeling the ground tremble beneath her. The pulse of her heartbeat synchronized with the flickering light, and she channeled every memory, every drop of fear and pain, into a single desperate beam that shot forth like a spear piercing through the darkness. The shadows howled in fury, engulfing her momentarily, their icy grasp wrapping around her throat, squeezing tighter. "You will suffer," they lamented, each voice merging into an unholy chorus, a vile threat that echoed through the void. But as she pressed on, the light expanded, breaking through the darkness like sunrise shattering the night. Shards of shadows exploded into the air, dissipating into nothingness, the cries of the lost souls rising like a ghastly symphony, fading slowly as they melted away. Emily's heart froze as she caught a glimpse of the creature. As she stepped forward, the air thickened with a sinister tension, twisting her insides like a coiled spring. Shadows flickered just beyond her vision, ebbing and flowing like a tide against the shore. Dread prickled at her skin, as if unseen eyes watched, calculating, hungry for her fear. With each heartbeat, the whispers grew louder, morphed into a chorus of tortured souls, fabricating a web of despair around her. Emily tightened her grip on whatever light she could muster, feeling its warmth wane under the onslaught of despair. Every flicker felt like a pulse, pounding in connection to the atmospheric dread that encircled her. She focused on the faces of the souls she'd saved, their expressions shifting between relief and unease. Splintered reflections of fear taunted her from every corner, echoing the struggles that loomed just out of reach. Suddenly, an unnatural chill swept through, crawling up her spine like icy fingers. The room seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting, pulsating with a malevolence that sank deep into her bones. It felt almost alive, an entity made of darkness, twisting and writhing, feeding off the fear swirling within. A singular shadow broke away from the others, larger, more defined, emerging with a solidity that sent her heart racing. Its shape was indistinct, yet she could perceive the malice within, a rift in her reality that smelled of decay and desperation. Without warning, the light flickered like a dying flame, illuminating the figure for a brief moment. Its eyes glimmered, a deep, soulless black, reflecting her own fear, pulling her into an abyss of endless despair. She stumbled backwards, the ground shifting as if alive beneath her feet, each step sending her deeper into its grasp. The shadows laughed, a guttural sound that reverberated in her chest, urging her to submit to the darkness they promised. "Join us," came a voice from the thickening blackness, smooth and silky, dripping with deceptive kindness. "You could be powerful here. All the memories, all the pain, it could be yours." In the moment, she recalled her mother's face, the warmth of her embrace that had long been absent. The shadows began to swirl faster, weaving her memories into a tapestry of grief, each thread glowing with her every loss. The laughter intensified, growing into a nightmarish symphony punctuated by the sharp essence of her anguish. She shook her head vehemently, fighting back against the wave of despair. "No," she gasped, searching for sanctuary in her memories, but the room pressed in closer, suffocating her remaining resolve. Just then, the shadows coiled tighter, constricting around her throat, cutting off her breath. Panic surged as the walls erupted with nightmarish images, faces twisted in pain, hands reaching out in a silent cry for help. Among the quick flashes, she spied her own likeness, contorted by grief, a reflection of the very horror she fought to escape. Each memory crashed upon her, a tidal wave of sorrow, eroding her will as the darkness pulsed forward like a living entity, wrapping around her like a shroud. With a sudden rush, she screamed, a raw, primordial sound that echoed through the void, desperation spilling from her lips. The shadows shuddered at her voice for just a heartbeat, and in that moment, the light flared once more, illuminating the grotesque features that surged from the dark. They were familiar, yet alien, faces of those she had lost morphing into nightmarish versions of themselves, enshrouded in shapeless grief and anger. Their eyes burned with accusation, mouths twisted into silent screams that echoed her inner turmoil. "You left us," they lamented, their voices cascading around her like a storm. "You abandoned us to this darkness." These revelations dug deep into her heart, twisting the knife of guilt, filling her gut with a bubbling cauldron of regret. "I didn't," she stammered, the words caught in her throat as shadows pressed closer, the oppressive air thickening with despair. "I tried to save you." But the figures only advanced, drawing nearer, their bodies morphing fluidly, swirling into grotesque shapes, flesh rotting and falling apart. One moment they appeared as her loved ones, and the next monstrous, decomposing wraiths obscured in layers of shadow. In their presence, she felt her spirit waning, each heartbeat sinking deeper into a well of dread, the anguish clawing at her from all sides. The room spun, warping around her, the walls looming closer, intent on crushing whatever light remained within. "You are one of us." Now, the shadows hissed, their collective voices simmering with ancient malice. "We will feed on your fear, your regrets, until there's nothing left." A burst of wind howled through the chambers, hair lifting and twisting wildly as if the very air itself sought to escape the turmoil. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperately focusing on the warmth of the light within her soul. But as she did, the shadows began to split, revealing a gaping maw at the center of the darkness, where a swirling abyss beckoned like a portal to hell. Panic surged through her as she felt it calling, a sensation like icy tendrils curling around her heart. What could lie in that void? Would submitting to that darkness grant her the peace she craved? A twisted promise of solace mingled with the dreadful urge to give in. Fight! Her mind screamed amidst the chaos, an instinct born from survival. She took a step back, feeling the ground beneath her solidify, the familiar sensation of loved ones growing fainter, their anguished cries muffled. "I will not lose myself," she shouted into the void, grasping at the flicker of light within her. The shadows recoiled momentarily, a rippling effect moving through the air as she felt a surge of strength rising from somewhere deep within. In a moment of clarity, Emily thrust out her hands, not in defense, but in defiance. She let the light pulse through her, unyielding and bright, flooding into the room with a brilliance that felt almost otherworldly. "You have no hold over me," she declared, her voice ringing clear, echoing through the shadows. With every ounce of power she could muster, the light exploded from her palms, a radiant wave crashing against the dark like the dawn breaking apart a moonless night. And for a heartbeat, she thought she saw the shadows loosen, their grasp faltering as the darkness hissed and writhed, struggling against the onslaught. But as quickly as it faded, the shadows surged back, slamming against her in a furious tide of rage and pain. New faces emerged, more horrors creeping from corners she had not thought to illuminate, twisted figures dripping with anguish, mouths agape with sorrow, drowning her in a sea of remorse. Each face grew more grotesque than the last, forming a nightmarish parade of suffering, advancing like a wall of despair intent on engulfing her whole. A sinister laugh swelled within the void, reverberating through her very soul as it echoed mockingly in the recesses of her mind. "Do you think light can banish me? You are weak, insignificant," it taunted, the voice like steel scraping against stone, an amalgamation of the souls she had failed to save. Doubt crept back into her heart, filling her chest with ice once more. Was this really the end? She refused to believe it, refusing to falter or succumb to the despair swirling around her. Yet, as despair mingled with terror, a sense of unease crawled deeper into her psyche, like a snake stealthily coiling around her thoughts. The room seemed to tilt, shadows twisting, mocking her fight, growing thicker, forming a wall of darkness that pressed in, a reminder of all she had lost. "Submit, Emily," they whispered sweetly, their voices rich with the poison of temptation. "Join us, let go of the fight." Within her, the strength flickered tenuously, battling against the encroaching darkness. She felt heavy, each breath a laborious effort against the weight of failure threatening to pull her down. Shadows slithered closer, ready to consume, the air clammy with tension, her skin prickled with unseen fingers gliding across her frame, making her skin crawl. She could hear the whispers now, each word distinct, intertwined sorrow and regret, a family betrayal echoing through the void that now seemed to choke her light. Each breath felt like it would be her last as the darkness thickened, wrapping around her mind like a vice. Emily steeled her resolve, forcing herself to draw from the memories of those she had loved, anchoring herself to the warmth of her mother's embrace, the laughter shared with friends. She would not waver. With a surge of anger and sorrow, she called to the others, those souls who still lingered in pain. "You are not alone," she shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We will break these chains together." The shadows recoiled from her words, uncertainty rippling through the mass as she pressed forward, refusing to let fear dictate her fate. "You have no power over me," she yelled again, each syllable breaking the tension enveloping her. And for the first time, the shadows stilled, a silence enveloping the darkness, tension thrumming in the air like a taut string ready to snap. But before she realized it, the silence shattered, replaced by a liquid sound that curled through the air, a low, chilling comfort that seemed to drain the warmth around her. From the depths of the blackened void, a figure began to rise, smooth and elongated, slick with shadow. It broke forth, not unlike a sea creature surfacing from murky depths, a monstrous face slowly revealing itself, angles sharp, eyes glinting like shards of glass, reflecting her horror back at her. "What have you done?" it rasped, voice rich with a terrible, unearthly echo, a melody of despair that coiled around her mind. "You do not get to leave. You don't get to win." Before she could react, the darkness lunged forward, spinning, coiling like a serpent around her limbs, creeping up towards her heart, a suffocating bind that stole away her breath. Panic surged through her once again, conflicting emotions pulsating as she struggled against the imposing grip of shadows seeking to retake her light. "Fight, Emily!" clamored a voice echoed somewhere deep within, clawing against the confines of the gathering nightmare. She summoned every ounce of courage, every shred of willpower still flickering within her. Almost instinctively, she drew the light within, allowing warmth to fill her core, empowering her from the inside as if a fire ignited, ready to incinerate the shadows. With an anguished cry, she planted her feet and pushed back, her heart thrumming wildly in an unspeakable rhythm. "Get away from me," she screamed, channeling the warmth through her trembling arms, thrusting it forth, a radiant shockwave that pushed against the encroaching dark. The initial blast momentarily stunned the shadows, their cries dissolving into chaos, but they regrouped instantaneously, wrapping tighter, their icy tendrils seeping into her skin, creeping through like a disease. "You still think you have the strength to fight?" they hissed, snarling like cornered beasts, their breath rancid with centuries-old rage. All at once, shards of nightmares began to emerge, whispering fragments of the past like poison in her veins, reminders of her mistakes swirling in taunting images, her failures echoing in hollow laughter that tore at the fabric of her resolve. The cacophony grew around her like an impenetrable fortress of despair, unraveling her memories like threads being pulled from a tapestry, each whisper tugging at her heart, seeking to claim her mind. Caught in the surge, terror clawed its way up from deep within, racing her pulse as she struggled to remain standing among the tide of darkness that threatened to drown her in its depths. "Help me!" Emily's voice splintered, torn between despair and the flickering hope that just maybe this moment wouldn't define her. But the shadows were relentless, their grasp snaking up towards her throat, constricting tighter with each breath. She could feel the fear saturating her thoughts, ringing louder as memories of loss echoed into her. Twining with the specters of her past, closing in all around, it felt as if 1,000 voices cried out at once, consuming her with despair. "This is your fate," they beckoned, the shadows morphing into elongated hands and twisted faces, reaching eagerly, attempting to pull her into their embrace. "You will never escape. Never be free again." With every ounce of her remaining courage, she fought against the debilitating panic clawing at her insides. She thought of the light, the warmth she'd once felt, and the faces of those who believed in her, each soul tied to her own. Summoning it all, she screamed once more, pouring every piece of her heart into the beam of light that erupted from her chest, illuminating the darkness surrounding her. The shadows shrieked, raw and furious, their cries a cacophony of anguish and rage, but she pressed forward, determined, pushing against the tide that sought to swallow her whole. "I will not let you take me," she shouted, the piercing light radiating fiercely from the brilliance of her heart. The waves surged outwards, lancing through the shadows like a spear of pure intent. As it sliced through the darkness, it felt like piercing flesh. An instinctual knowledge screamed at her that the shadows bled. They writhed in agony, becoming indistinct shapes, faces melting into the void where they screeched, shrieked, and roared. "You think light can burn us?" A voice coiled malice around every word, thick and oily like black tar. Each syllable dripped with disdain, wrapping around her like fog as the shadows throbbed, pulsating with rage. With brutal force, they lunged at her, a ravenous pack of spirits, blackened wisps of sorrow and fury entwining into tendrils eager to grasp her, clawing at her skin, hungry to drag her into their embrace. The air grew cold, a biting chill stealing the warmth of her light, each phantom finger sliding across her face, trailing, leaving a trail of frozen dread, igniting the fear hiding in her core. They raved and hissed, calling to her deepest fears, those buried regrets clawing their way to the surface, oozing into her thoughts like a noxious fog. "Remember what you did? How you failed them," the shadows taunted, their sinister whispers dripping through the cracks of her resolve. Images of her past rushed at her like a tidal wave. Her mother's face, contorted in anguish the last time she saw her hands shaking, pleading for help that never came. Friends she couldn't save. A scream hanging in the air like a phantom, echoing endlessly in her mind. A chorus of despair converging upon her, dragging her deeper into the chasm of memories soaked in sorrow. In that moment, the bright light flickered, its radiance dimming as doubt crept in, a thief in the night. She fell to her knees, feeling her strength waning as the shadows drew closer, their whispers curling around her throat, wrapping tighter with every heartbeat, twisting her resolve as if they were vines creeping under her skin. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" they spat, their voice layered, a haunting symphony of anger and despair. Suddenly, she felt herself slipping, consciousness fading as the shadows enveloped her, their darkness thick and suffocating like a heavy fog that clouded her senses and muffled her cries for help. With every heartbeat, everything she held close began to unravel, losing the light of hope that had burned so fiercely within her. Then, out of the suffocating dark, a blinding pain shot through her mind as if someone had plunged a dagger into her thoughts. She gasped, her breath escaping her like a broken promise, a sharp cry dying in her throat. The shadows twisted and coiled tightly around her, their movement serpentine, slithering against her skin. Images flashed before her eyes, of twisted trees reaching their skeletal fingers toward a sky that dripped crimson, an endless landscape marred by vines covered in thorns, sharp and threatening. "Welcome to your truth," the voices sang, a chaotic lullaby that drummed against her head. "This is your reckoning." The ground quaked as the shadows morphed into a swirling vortex, drawing her into its festering maw, where it seemed time lost all meaning. Tentacles of darkness lashed out, laced with a chill that seeped into her bones, wrapping around her ankles, eating away at her spirit as they dragged her down, down into the depths of despair. Each pulse of pain reverberated through the darkness, an ancient rhythm synchronizing with her heartbeat, trapping her in a dance of dread. Just when it felt like it was all over, something in her flickered, crackling against the suffocating gloom. She focused on that small spark within, summoning it with all her might. The light inside her fought against the tendrils of despair, pushing forward with a desperate scream. "No, I won't be lost." She felt the shadows recoil, their snarls rising into a chorus of fury as the light expanded, a desperate sun breaking through the storm clouds, illuminating the grotesque forms cloaked in despair. Faces emerged again, but this time they weren't mere phantoms of regret. They were the remnants of souls she had failed, their expressions twisted with unfinished business and unwritten apologies. "What do you want from me?" she cried, eyes wide as she met their sightless gazes, horror creeping through her veins as they edged closer, their mouths stretching into impossibly wide grins that split their faces. They swarmed, a whirl of grief-stricken creatures whose wailing grew louder, pressing in like a relentless tide, each tethered to her by invisible threads of shared pain. With each breath, she felt herself being pulled under again. But this time, she would not let despair claim her. Gritting her teeth, Emily focused on each flicker of hope, pulling memories of laughter and love against the oppressive darkness. "You do not decide my fate," she roared, her voice a battle cry against the anguish that threatened to crush her spirit. The shadows stiffened, momentarily taken aback as she surged forward, buoyed by her defiance. Emily pushed her light outwards in a fierce explosion of brilliance, illuminating the figures before her, their screams turning to shrieks of torment as they were scorched by the intensity of her resolve. The ground beneath them trembled violently, fracturing with a loud crack, like the sound of 1,000 bones snapping at once. But as they writhed, confusion consumed the shadows, fangs bared and eyes ablaze with hatred. They gathered in a vortex of swirling darkness, forming a grotesque cyclone. The air crackled with malevolence, a palpable dread that clawed its way up her spine, unintelligible whispers filling her ears, mocking her defiance, turning to a roar of anguish. "You can't escape us. You have taken so much already. You owe us." The ground split, jagged fissures breaking apart beneath her feet, flames rising from the depths of the abyss, illuminating the twisted figures in an angry glow. They lunged toward her en masse, limbs stretching unnaturally, fingers elongated into vicious claws, teeth cracking open like ancient doors leading to the unfathomable depths of horror she yearned to escape. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice shaking with the force of a thunderstorm. As if summoned by her fury, the light flared brighter, a shield against the impending tide of doom rushing toward her like a steel wall. The ground shook violently again, and the shadows faltered, their movements stuttering as they recoiled from the brightness threatening to engulf them. Yet, just as she thought victory was within reach, a blistering chill swept through the air, warping the light, a suffocating fog descending rapidly, extinguishing the fire of her hope as disembodied whispers rose in a suffocating crescendo. "You can't escape your truth. Surrender. Let us in." Emily felt something deep within her begin to crack, the fierce momentum shifting. The shadows seized the moment, latching onto her like leeches, dragging her into a black hole of despair. As the darkness clawed at her mind, she glimpsed reality slipping away, her memories swirling around her like forgotten remnants of a life half-lived, drifting hungrily toward the void as the shadows reached within, eager to harvest the last vestiges of her strength. "No, I refuse," she screamed through the clamor of their voices, her heart pounding in rhythm with the encroaching nightmare. She grappled for the light inside her, pulling it up once more, feeding it every ounce of rage and heartache, letting it pulse and ignite in one final act of defiance. And as the shadows climbed higher, scraping through her defenses, scrambling to consume her, she unleashed that light with a raw intensity, sending it spiraling outward like a supernova. It erupted, bathing the dark in blinding radiance, a shockwave of brilliance that unleashed a deafening roar through the air, shattering the oppressive gloom for a heartbeat, exposing the truth of her own fears and failures. But in that moment of vulnerability, as she stood vulnerable against the tide, the shadows hesitated. The light erupting through them felt like a reckoning, a moment stretched in time where every soul she had lost, every wound she had carried was laid bare. And just like that, every horror she had hidden in the recesses of her mind came flooding forth, not as a malevolent force, but as though she loved, smiling yet sorrowful, hands reaching toward her, urging her to confront what had haunted her for so long, standing between her and a past she struggled to process. "Face us," they whispered, their voices blending into a melancholic harmony that resonated deep in her heart. "Don't run from what makes you you." A wave of understanding washed over her, stronger than any darkness that threatened to consume. Embracing her truth, Emily took a deep breath, reaffirming the strength that had always been within her. The shadows shrieked in fury, the dissonance rising in their collective sorrow, but she held firm, choosing to confront the pain instead of allowing it to overwhelm her. And through the chaos, with clarity illuminating the depths of her heart, she realized that they were not her enemies, but teachers, shadows illuminating her journey, a twisted reflection of the very battle she had fought, each scar a testament to survival. "I am not afraid," she bellowed, fists clenched, her resolve solidifying like steel. With every ounce of power now harnessed, she drew upon the brilliance that surged through her veins and aimed it at the shadows, the last remnants of fear twisting in their forms. Emily was ready to redefine her fate, and as she unleashed her final attempt, a whirlwind of light engulfed the darkness, transforming the void into a realm painted with vivid, radiant colors. The shadows wavered, yanking at her painfully, but they began to tremble under the brilliance as she stepped forward, inviting their fury to be met with acceptance. In that singular moment of desperate courage, the frightful vortex shattered into shards of light, fracturing into a kaleidoscope of emotions that painted her surroundings. As each entity began to dissolve, their screams replaced by soft, welcoming whispers. "Let us go. We are ready," they cheered, their reactions turning into a gentle breeze that brushed past her, urging her to move. With the shadows receding into the light, they finally unraveled, revealing a lilt of hope that danced in the air, and she felt the weight of burdens lift from her shoulders as the sorrow began to melt away, making room for something new, something hopeful. In a wave of newfound purpose, Emily stepped forward into the light, drawing from the experience of those she had fought against and those she had loved, releasing everything she had been trapped by. And as she did, the realm shifted once more, reshaping into something unimaginable, something that offered a glimpse of the future waiting beyond survival and sorrow. As Emily stepped into the light, a chill wrapped around her like a shroud. The colors that painted the landscape swirled wildly, becoming jagged and sharp, each hue twisting into something grotesque. Shapes danced at the corners of her vision, dark figures lurking just beyond her reach, their outlines barely visible, twitching like dying flames. A low, guttural hum rose from the ground, vibrating through her bones, a sound that felt both familiar and foreign. In the distance, an abandoned village emerged from the chaos, a collection of dilapidated houses leaning dangerously, as though held up only by the weight of despair. The windows, gaping holes like empty eye sockets, seemed to stare back at her. Shadows flickered within every hollow space, beckoning her closer with whispers that slithered in her ears, promising secrets and the allure of understanding. As she approached, the air turned thick and heavy, every step weighed down by an unseen force, as if the very ground wished to keep her from advancing. The first house she reached was draped in creeping vines, their thorny tendrils snaking around the wooden beams like skeletal hands seeking to trap her. A creeping dread pooled in her stomach, yet she pushed the door open, the screech of rusted hinges slicing through the silence. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust motes that shimmered in the feeble light filtering through broken windows. But it was the walls that drew her attention, covered in faded, peeling wallpaper that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Etched into the surface were faces, contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams as if begging for freedom that never came. She reached out to touch a particularly anguished visage, her fingers grazing the paper, and a tremor ran through her, each heartbeat echoing the fear that was murky and suffocating. Suddenly, the floor creaked beneath her weight, a sound like a warning signal, and the darkness in the corners deepened, gathering into a palpable presence. From the shadows, a figure began to materialize, its shape indiscernible, cloaked in a fog so thick it devoured all light. Emily's breath quickened as she attempted to step backward, but the door slammed shut behind her, imprisoning her in that room. "Emily," a voice hissed, low and gravelly, like gravel grinding slowly beneath the weight of something heavy. It echoed all around her, the very walls trembling at the utterance of her name. "You cannot hide from your past." The voice was both disembodied and intimate, as if it emanated from the shadows themselves, drawing closer with every syllable. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the dimness as she turned, scanning the room frantically. The shadows around her seemed to twist and writhe, elongating, reaching out with grasping fingers that clawed at her sanity. She spotted a mirror across the room, its surface cracked and tarnished, reflecting only the dark behind her. But something flickered in the edges. A face, pale and gaunt, appeared for a fleeting moment, eyes hollow yet brimming with an unsettling recognition. "Help me," it pleaded, a sound like glass shattering in the stillness, only to be swallowed back by the dark. Emily stumbled back, trapped in a nightmare where the lines of reality blurred. She turned to run but froze as she heard whispers slithering from the darkness. Stay with us," they cooed, merging into an agonizing chant, dripping with longing and despair. The floorboards began to shift beneath her feet, twisting like serpents ready to strike and pull her down into their depths. The dark shadows rushed forward, eager to ensnare her, their chill fingertips grazing her skin, leaving a trail of icy dread in their wake. With every ounce of courage, Emily lunged for the door, her heart pounding like a war drum, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, their whispers rising to a cacophony of torment. Images of her past flashed before her eyes, faces of those she had lost, the memories of laughter now overshadowed by screams of agony. Guilt wrapped around her throat, choking her with the weight of their unfulfilled desires and words left unsaid. "Why did you leave us?" the voice cried, now sharp and piercing, resonating within the walls, seeking her soul. She pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, enveloping her in an auditory storm of pain and regret. "You owe us." The air turned electric, a charge crackling around her as the shadows formed a vortex, swirling like a tempest, pulling her toward the center. Desperation shot through her veins. She couldn't go back to that darkness, couldn't succumb to the weight of their sorrow. She needed to escape, to break free from the grip of her past. In that moment, a flicker of determination ignited within her, a spark that surged forth as she shouted into the whirlwind. "I am done with you." Her voice pierced the haze, reverberating against the chaos, shaking the very foundation of the nightmares surrounding her. As if the darkness recoiled from her declaration, the storm stuttered, hesitating as it fought against the onslaught of her resolve. Seizing the fleeting opportunity, She hurled herself against the door with everything she had, and it gave way, slamming open with such force that it sent the shadows crashing backward, fracturing their form as reality ripped back into view. She stumbled outside, breathless and wild-eyed, the haunted village collapsing into itself behind her, echoes of ghostly wails trailing off like smoke on the wind. But just when relief began to wash over her, she found herself in an endless forest, branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers reaching down to snatch her up. The light dimmed, the colors fading into grays and browns, and a sinister silence loomed all around her. "Welcome," a voice rasped, too close yet too far, emerging from the shadows of the trees. The ground shifted again, an unsettling rumble beneath the soil, and as she turned to run, the forest began to morph, the trees bending and twisting unnaturally as if they were alive. They leaned toward her, whispering secrets in a language she could almost understand, a cacophony of warnings and threats that mingled with the rustle of leaves. Branches reached for her, thorny limbs stretching like the fingers of the lost soul she had encountered, wrapping around her legs, dragging her into the underbrush. "You cannot escape what you have done," they whispered, echoing the heartache that followed her every step. "Come and face your true self." Panic surged within her as she fought against their grasp, writhing and twisting. Just then, the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the forest with a ghostly glow. In that light, Emily saw faces carved into the bark of the trees, each one twisted in torment, reflecting sorrow and anger. They all stared at her, eyes wide and accusing, revealing the truth behind every dark corner of her mind. They were the remnants of lives she had touched, the mistakes she could never rectify. "Join us," they hissed, a whispered command that slithered into her thoughts, threatening to echo her unfulfilled dreams and every failure she had ever faced. "We are waiting." With a surge of adrenaline, Emily pulled herself free of the vines, the urgency to break free from their binding cries urging her to run deeper into the forest. But the shadows trailed behind, a dark cloud merging with the night, their hungry whispers echoing through the trees like a death knell. Each step felt heavier, the forest shifting and closing in around her, branches entwining to form a labyrinth of despair, taunting her with every detour. Just as hope seemed lost, she stumbled into a clearing bathed in moonlight, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness. In the center stood an ancient well, its mouth yawning wide, a pit of blackness that seemed to beckon her closer. The air felt charged with magic and dread, a paradoxical pull that sent shivers cascading down her spine. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she leaned closer, peering into the depths. "Help us," a voice floated up from within the well, eerily familiar and hauntingly distant. "Join us in the dark. We could be one." The shadows gathered around her, swirling with anticipation, urging her to step forward and surrender. The feeling of dread clawed at her heart, an echo of the darkness that had pursued her through every twist and turn of her journey. Emily took a step back, her instincts screaming to flee, but she was rooted in place, trapped between the well and the encroaching shadows. "No," she shouted, fury rising within her. "I will not be a part of this." And as she cried out, the ground trembled once more. Tendrils of darkness spiraled upward from the well, reaching toward her like 1,000 desperate hands, craving her essence. In that moment, she realized that whatever lay in the depths wasn't just a void, but a part of her, a manifestation of fear, regret, and every unresolved fragment that had haunted her. "I will not let you take me," Emily screamed, forcing her rage outward, channeling every ounce of pain and loss into a powerful declaration of existence. The dark tendrils hesitated, their grip faltering as the light ignited within her, flaring brighter against the engulfing darkness. She stood tall, confronting the abyss of her own making, ready to claim her identity amidst the chaos. As that light intensified, a scream erupted from the well, a cacophony of voices echoed and blended into a terrifying symphony of desperation. Emily braced herself for the storm, the air crackling as she pressed forward, prepared to face the shadows she had long feared. But what awaited her would not be a battle of light against dark. Instead, the well began to shudder violently, the ground heaving as if the very earth were alive, raging against the truth she was about to uncover. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms distorting into nightmarish shapes, bloated with the memories they held, ready to unleash years of pent-up anguish. She realized that to claim her future, she must confront not only the darkness outside, but also the darkness deep within herself. And as she took a step toward the fraying edge of the well, the last vestiges of her past rose up, swirling around her like a tempest, until they all converged into one singular figure, a reflection of herself, twisted and broken, yet composed of the very essence she sought to escape. "Face me," the figure whispered, a dark smile stretching across its ghastly face, eyes gleaming with an unsettling promise. Emily drew a shuddering breath, bracing herself for the most profound reckoning of all. "Face me," the figure whispered, a dark smile stretching across its ghastly face, eyes gleaming with an unsettling promise. The air around Emily crackled, charged with unease as she felt the weight of its gaze, an intense scrutiny that dug into her soul. Its presence drew her in like a moth to a flame, and for a heartbeat, she teetered on the edge of her own dread. The reflection of her twisted self moved, its body bending and warping, shadows spilling from it like dark ink on water. "I am every fear you've buried," it taunted, voice echoing in the clearing, unsettling in its familiarity. "Every regret, every moment of weakness. Stop running from me." Suddenly, the ground cracked, sending splinters of earth shooting out like daggers. One shard pierced the air, narrowly missing her shoulder, and she jumped back just in time. The well's mouth widened, pulsating as if alive, and shadows began surging upward, morphing into gnarled hands that clutched at her feet, trying to pull her down. Her heart raced as she stepped back, the creature's laughter sounding like a chorus of ghosts enveloping her from all sides. Each chuckle throbbed within her chest, as if they were drawing energy from her own fears. In that moment, she couldn't tell where she ended and the dark began. It felt as if the shadows had been siphoning her essence, and the more they reached for her, the more alive she felt, feeding off the panic that coursed through her veins. "Join me," it hissed, and the forest teetered in response, branches twisting menacingly overhead. Together we thrive in eternal darkness. With a terrified gasp, she felt the ground shifting beneath her again, and she stumbled backward, her eyes darting to the trees that seemed to lean closer, their gnarled forms reaching out like skeletal hands grasping for something lost. She could feel the haunted echoes of those long gone reverberating through the air, a symphony of sorrow that made her skin crawl. The night deepened around her, shrouding the clearing in an oppressive cloak of darkness that pressed heavily on her chest. She turned to escape, but the clearing morphed before her. The well, once a portal of foreboding, was now a vortex, pulling her toward its inky depths. Desperate, she turned and sprinted, branches scraping against her skin as if trying to leave their mark, their whispers growing louder. The words, harsh and fragmentary, echoed banefully in her mind, each step dragging her deeper into a nightmare. Moments stretched like shadows, and she could almost see glimpses of her past weaving through the branches. Lost friends, missed opportunities, all the things she wished she could forget. Breathless and panicked, Emily pushed through the density of the trees, heart pounding like a war drum. But the darkness was relentless, folding in on her in waves that felt almost sentient, alive with malice. The deeper she ran, the more distorted the path became. She stumbled upon a clearing where the trees whispered her name, weaving in and out of focus. And when she turned, she found herself facing the identical figure that had emerged from the well. "Did you really think you could escape?" it crooned, and the smile twisted into something grotesque, skin slick with shadow and regret. "We are the same, you and I." In that instant, shadows erupted from the ground, manifesting into phantoms, reflecting the lives she had failed or left behind. Each figure screamed in agony, their voices melding into a horrid cacophony that clawed at her mind, trying to pull her into the fray. They reached for her, ravenous spirits with hollow eyes, desperate for release, fingers grasping at the corners of her sanity. "Face us! Face what you've become!" One spirit wailed, and Emily felt her heart drop. The air thickened, crushing her lungs as dread seeped into her bones. She staggered back, every ounce of her wanting to dissolve into the shadows rather than confront the truth lurking just beneath the surface. But as the shadows reached out, she felt a spark of defiance flicker within. No more running, no more hiding from the horrors of her own creation. Summoning every ounce of strength, she stepped forward, her voice trembling but unwavering. "You don't control me. I'm not defined by you." The moment the words left her lips, a shriek tore through the forest, as though the woods themselves were tearing apart under the weight of her declaration. The phantoms shrank away, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke, leaving only echoes of their pain reverberating in the silence. But the dark figure that mirrored her didn't fade. It loomed larger, shadows swirling around it like a tempest. "You can't cast aside the truth," it shrieked, voice now a throaty growl, resonating with rage. "We are bound together." A surge of anger coursed through Emily as the figure unleashed a shrill cry, hands clawing at the air, beckoning the shadows to converge upon her again. But as they came, Emily focused on the light that pulsed within her. It flickered and grew, illuminating the chaos enveloping her. She felt a warmth building, spreading from her core, reaching out like tendrils of light piercing through the caustic darkness. "I am more than my fears," she shouted into the swirling void. As the shadows collided against her brilliance, they writhed and hissed, but she refused to back down. With each affirmation, the light surged, casting tendrils that began to tear at the loom of darkness. It felt intoxicating, powerful, a part of her that had been shrouded for too long. As the chaotic shadows recoiled, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, cracks spiderwebbing through the earth. The air thickened with anticipation, scenting of damp soil and ancient secrets, as if the forest itself held its breath in this pivotal moment. Emily stood tall, feeling the pulse of her heart sync with the rhythm of the earth, resonating with the very essence of life. And then, with one final push, she thrust her hands forward, releasing everything: the pain, the sorrow, the shadows that had haunted her. Light erupted from her, a blinding radiance that sliced through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the space around her. The scream of the figure felt like ice scraping against glass, echoing through the clearing. In that instant, she understood. Every shadow, every regret, every haunting memory was a part of the life she lived, and accepting them was the key to her freedom. As the light expanded, it swallowed the darkness, illuminating the twisted forms of her past, revealing them in their true shape, wounded, fragile, but also deserving of compassion. The forest erupted into a kaleidoscope of colors as the shadows melted away, retreating from the light with anguished howls. The figure shuddered, its form distorting and flickering, caught in the gravitational pull of her radiance. She felt the boundaries of her consciousness stretch, intertwining with the very essence of the world around her. The trees stood tall, leaves shimmering with emerald hues, the night giving way to the soft glow of dawn, a rebirth from the ashes of suffering. But even amidst the emerging light, a lingering chill threaded through the air, a dark whisper riding the wind. "This isn't over." Emily froze, heart pounding in her chest as the words echoed ominously, resonating deep within her soul. There was a tension in the air, a fragment of darkness that refused to dissolve completely, swirling like smoke just at the edge of her perception. She turned slowly, wary of the shadows lingering at the fringes of the forest. "Look closer," the wind seemed to murmur. "You can't escape what lurks within." New faces flickered at the edge of her vision. Shadows formed, but these were different. They were more solid, more real. They bore expressions she recognized, sad, filled with longing, a spectrum of emotions that pricked at her heart. They moved silently, weaving between the trees, as if drawn to her light, hungry for release yet reluctant to dissolve into the glow. "Face us again," one whispered, voice barely a breath, yet somehow carrying the weight of 1,000 prayers, 1,000 forgotten promises. "You've only begun to understand." The creeping unease clawed at her again, gripping her tightly, but she fought it back. Each face was a reminder, an invitation to confront the truths she had tried to bury. With trembling resolve, she stepped toward the closest shadow, the familiar face of a friend long gone, their eyes filled with unspoken words. "Please," it urged, and that one simple plea shattered the carefully constructed barriers she had built around herself. Realization dawned within her. Empathy was not weakness but strength. By facing the pain ingrained in her heart, she could banish the shadows once and for all. In the light of dawn, hope began to blossom, and within her, the dark echoes quaked in anticipation, shadow and light entwining like an eternal dance. "Stay," she breathed, reaching out. "I'm ready to hear you." The shadows surrounding her surged at her words, eyes widening, reflecting a mix of hope and fear. They began to converge, swirling and coiling around her like smoke, ready to seep back into her very being. A wave of vertigo swept over her, and she staggered, the light she had summoned flickering as she braced for the impending storm. But instead of suffocating, she inhaled deeply, absorbing the chaos, the pain, the sorrow, and the love that lived and died with these spirits. "I will not let you go. I will remember you." In that moment of acceptance, the air around her shimmered, filled with whispers of gratitude, converging into a single bright orb that ignited a warmth deep within her heart. Recognition enveloped her as the specters shimmered and solidified, manifesting their stories in flashes of light. "Thank you," they chorused, voices echoing around her like a gentle breeze, weaving whispers of comfort through her mind. And as the shadows soared into the sky, the forest brightened, vibrant greens and deep browns transforming under the dawn's embrace. But even as the last echo of their whispers faded, and the sun rose over the horizon, the lingering darkness reminded her that this was just the beginning. The comfort she found came with a cost. There were more shadows to confront, more truths that needed unraveling. With a heavy exhale, she knew she had to delve deeper into the stories yet untold, to face the remnants of the past and uncover the secrets they held. And so, in that dawn-lit forest, amidst the ghostly remnants of her past, Emily steeled herself for the journey ahead, ready to embrace both the light and the darkness in the uncharted chapters of her life. As Emily took a deep breath, the air felt cooler, almost cloying, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Each step she took deeper into the forest felt deliberate, almost as if the ground itself was shifting under her feet in a subtle dance, creeping with the intent of guiding her towards something unseen. The light that had once felt comforting now seemed to attract shadows lurking, twisting and blanketing the edges of the trees. Branches reached out like gnarled fingers, scratching at her skin, drawing her gaze toward the dark recesses where the light struggled to shine. She could feel the weight of something watching, eyes embedded in the darkness, hungry and curious, waiting for her to stumble or show weakness. Just then, the wind hushed as if all creatures of the night had paused their existence. The chorus of chirping crickets fell silent, replaced by the sound of something heavier, a soft shuffling in the brush just behind her, followed by an unsettling silence. Goosebumps prickled her skin. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a familiar face, but instead found nothing more than empty shadows. Her heart raced as she pressed on, the path twisting in ways she didn't remember. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their silhouettes looming like ancient sentinels. She felt the coolness of the ground shift beneath her again, as if the earth could swallow her whole at any moment. Then, from somewhere deeper in the thicket, a voice broke through the quiet, a soft, melodic tone, disjointed, almost mocking. It called her name, sweet and terrible, echoing like a distant lullaby. "Emily, come play." The words danced on the breeze, curling around her senses, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine, making her instincts scream to run. But curiosity drew her in, a magnetic pull that felt like a thread winding tighter around her mind. She took a tentative step forward, heart pounding in her ears as the voice continued, weaving in and out of clarity. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, darting behind trees, but never revealing themselves. "Just a little closer. Don't be afraid," it sang, a haunting sound that seemed to echo with the laughter of children playing in the dark, inviting yet filled with an undercurrent of malice. Emily hesitated, forced to grapple with an all-consuming dread creeping into her thoughts. Suddenly, she stumbled into a small clearing that pulsated with an unnatural energy. Stone altar-like slabs jutted from the ground, slick with moisture, reflecting the ephemeral glow of fungus growing in patterns that looked almost too organized, as if they were mapping something sinister. In the center of the altar lay a rotting doll, its porcelain skin cracked, gray patches spreading from its hollow eyes, as though the darkness itself had seeped into its very essence. She crouched down instinctively, but the ground beneath her groaned, a low and mournful sound that resonated through her bones. Within that disquiet, she beheld the mouth of a gaping maw at the very center of the altar, as if the earth itself was hungry, waiting for an offering, awaiting something to claim. The air thickened again, a heaviness settling down upon her, twisting her gut until she could hardly breathe. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her every movement, filled with a sentience that felt far too real. She reached out to touch it, drawn to the decay, to the stories trapped within an object that should never have belonged here. Just as her fingers brushed against the brittle surface, a shriek pierced the air, shattering the stillness. Emily jumped back as the shadows erupted around her, swirling violently like a tempest. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their faces obscured, yet she could feel their anguished expressions pressing against her mind. They were the lost souls, the same ones she had seen in distorted silhouettes before. But now they were clearer, tangible, their energy pulsing with a chaotic rhythm, each one an echo of pain and desperation. "Release us," they cried, voices a haunting chorus layered with sorrow, stretching out their hands, ghastly fingers reaching for her in a warped semblance of affection. The forest hummed with their grief, a dissonant melody that threatened to pull her under. You can set us free." She recoiled, backing away from the altar, heart slamming against her ribs. "What do you want from me?" The words felt weak against their cries, swallowed by the ancient trees around her. "Your light," one rasped, its figure flickering like a flame about to extinguish. "We need your light to live again." The ground trembled, and suddenly the altar began to crack, jagged fissures, opening, spewing forth dark, viscous ooze that pooled around her feet. The figures writhed, twisting in agony, pulling against invisible chains that bound them to the earth. She felt their pull deep within the marrow of her bones, compelling her to help them, but dread clawed at her throat like a vice. "No, I won't. Please," they shouted, voices layered in hysteria. "You don't understand. We're trapped." Their pleading turned to howls, the atmosphere vibrating with desperation, urging her to do something, anything to help them. But she felt the pull of her own roots, the darkness swirling inside her heart, threatening to join theirs. Panic ignited within her, and she turned to flee. The shadows lunged forward, grasping at her limbs, tugging with a frightening intensity that threatened to pull her back into their torment. She struggled, composing herself with the thought of the day that broke around her, the sunlight beckoning just beyond the trees. "Stay with us." They lunged, faces revealing expressions of anguish and rage, fingers clawing at her clothes, tearing at her skin. Emily's scream caught in her throat as she felt her body being dragged closer to the altar, the ground becoming a whirlpool of darkness intent on consuming her. Just as despair swallowed her resolve, she caught a glimpse of the doll again. It had changed, its cracked surface now forming a cruel smile, mouth twisting into a sneer, as if it were taunting her. It knew her fears, knew her sorrow, and was hungry for her despair. Gathering all her strength, Emily pulled free from the miasma of pain surrounding her. With every ounce of will, she turned her back on those faces of misery, determined not to yield. Sprinting through the clearing, branches clawed at her, but she pushed through the veil of shadow, light spilling in from the edges of the forest like a beacon. Yet, as she broke past the tree line into the open space, the ground quaked with a thunderous roar. The altar erupted behind her, sending tendrils of shadow streaming into the sky. The wails of the spirits transformed into an agonizing crescendo, echoing through the forest, and she stumbled forward into the brilliant dawn just in time to witness a dark storm brewing overhead. Black clouds coalesced, swirling ominously as if consciousness itself had gathered to observe her flight. It smiled, a sinister formation that seemed to pulse with malevolence. And as the wind howled, a voice echoed through her mind, pressing against her thoughts like ice against her spine. "You can't escape. This is just the beginning." A frigid dread pooled in her stomach as the realization hit her. She may have fled the altar, but the curse of the shadows would follow. The sun shining down felt colder now, as though biding its time, waiting for the inevitable clash. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, scratching at her mind like the talons of a monstrous beast that had not yet revealed itself. This time, they were not just echoes of the past. They were promises of terror waiting to unfold. Breath hitching in her throat, Emily knew she could never truly leave those spirits behind. The shadows were bound to her, and the darkness clawing at her heart was only a fragment of something more, something that had yet to awaken. What lay ahead was a journey wrought with terror, where each step might lead her deeper into the abyss lurking within herself. And somewhere, far beyond the treeline, the heart of the forest whispered secrets of its own, secrets that would reveal themselves in the suffocating embrace of darkness, a darkness she would soon come to know all too intimately. As she staggered away from the tree line, an unnatural chill seized her, like icy fingers closing around her heart. The shadows entwined with her feet, beckoning her to look back. She fought the urge, knowing that the forest's grasp would grip her tighter if she paused. Panic surged as she darted across the field, her breath quick and hot against the eerie air. But every glance over her shoulder revealed the shadows stretching, morphing into twisted shapes that seemed to mock her desperate flight. The ground beneath her seemed alive, shifting as though the earth itself was conspiring against her. Each step felt heavier, like wading through water thick with despair. And then, from her left, a low growl erupted, sending a tremor through her bones. She whipped around, eyes wide, heart pounding in her chest. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, a grotesque silhouette warped and unnaturally tall, rising above the grass like a dark phantom. Its limbs were impossibly long and twisted, joints bending in angles that defied nature, hands clawing at the air with an unsettling grace. Instinct screaming, she turned and ran again, but the creature followed, gliding over terrain with eerie silence. She could hear her heartbeat thrumming in her ears, louder than the rustling leaves. Desperately, she dashed toward the nearby, abandoned cabin she had spotted earlier, its weathered timbers standing defiantly against the encroaching darkness. As she reached the door, she swung it open with shaking hands, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind her, hoping for some semblance of safety. But the air within felt stale and thick, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. Inside, the darkness clung to her, pressing down while the cabin creaked ominously, as if it recognized her fear. Dust motes danced in the faint light that filtered through cracks in the aged wood. She turned to look for an escape, but her heart sank as reality set in. There were no windows here, no way out. Shadows pooled in the corners, shifting as if alive. An unsettling thought flickered in her mind. What if she was not alone? The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as whispers began to swirl around her, hissing from the shadows. Ghostly murmurs pushed against her senses, coiling tighter until she felt dizzy. They spoke her name, repeating it like a sinister chant, their voices layered with urgency and despair. "Emily, join us, stay with us." Each syllable slithered into her mind, wrapping around her consciousness, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, the walls seemed to bend, closing in on her, the very air thickening with sorrowful energy. Objects began to rattle on rotting shelves. The musty smell of damp would fill her lungs. A picture frame teetered and fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. Within the fragments lay the face she had dreaded seeing. The doll from the altar, its cracked smile now bigger, malevolent. It was a taunt, a reminder of hope tarnished by darkness. Desperate echoes of fury filled the space as her hands trembled, and she felt a jolt of pain as something cold wrapped around her ankle. She gasped and looked down to find fingers, skeletal and decayed, grasping her legs as the shadows ooze upwards, inching toward her skin. They yanked her, pulling, dragging her closer to the center of the room. Emily screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere, her voice lost amidst the sinister whispers echoing in her thoughts. "Release us. Take our place," the shadows moaned, their tugging growing stronger, their insistence frantic. In that moment, desperation boiled over. She had to escape, to vanquish whatever was binding her to this torment. She remembered the stories of light, how it drove back the darkness. With newfound resolve, Emily scrambled to her feet, her eyes scanning the cabin for something, anything that could help. Her fingers grazed over an old lantern sitting forgotten on a shelf, a remnant of warmth lost in time. She fumbled with it, her breath a ragged whisper as she struck a match, the tiny flame glimmering to life against the looming shadows. The moment the light illuminated the room, a shriek erupted from the depths, piercing through the veil of despair. Shadows recoiled as if burned, a cacophony of voices howling in anger. "Not the light. We need the darkness," they cried, a chorus shrill with pain and rage. The room quaked as the malevolent entities surged forward, desperate to reclaim their hold on her. The lantern flickered, casting frantic shapes on the walls, each flicker revealing faces of anguish frozen in tormented expressions. Emily could feel their sorrow draw nearer, a tidal wave of dread that threatened to drown her as the light grew dimmer. Her hands trembled, but she held the light steady, focusing on its warmth and brilliance, on the memories of laughter and the bright sun outside the forest. "You won't take me," she shouted, voice strong against the storm of anguish clawing at her mind. As if fueled by her defiance, the light flared brighter, illuminating the corners of the room, shattering the darkness for a moment, the shadows dancing away like frightened children. But they were relentless. With a pulse of fury, the energy surged once more, darkness crashing against the light, threatening to engulf her in totality. The table splintered, the roof cracked, and Emily's heart raced in panic. This battle was far from over. She could hear the tortured cries of lost souls, each one vying for her attention, dragging at her spirit, urging her to submit. "Embrace the void. Join us," they called, voices warping into a terrible melody that echoed off the walls, promising belonging and safety. Each word twisted in her gut, hungry and vile. "Let go and become one with us." With every ounce of strength, Emily channeled her fear into the light. She raised the lantern high, focusing on the memories of joy, of love, of the bright things in her life. She poured every heartfelt sentiment into the flickering flame, feeling the warmth spread through her. The shadows hissed, recoiling as if burned. "You can't win against the darkness," they shrieked, but their voices trembled, faltering in the glow of her defiance. As the light exploded from the lantern, she watched in awe as the shadows writhed, disintegrating before her eyes, the weight of their anguish collapsing like a broken dream. The cabin shuddered violently, a convulsion of long-buried sorrows tearing free. It seemed that the veil was lifting, revealing the emptiness behind them, a void that called to her with promises of freedom, yet echoed with sadness. Emily stumbled back, blinking as the brightness filled her vision, the shadows disbanding like smoke in the wind. The walls of the cabin began to dissolve, fading as the laughter of the forest returned, a sound both haunting and beautiful. She clutched the lantern, feeling it pulse with power and watching as the last tendril of shadow dissipated into the light. But amid the chaos, a chilling realization crystallized within her. As the cabin flaked away into nothingness, the forest remained, always waiting, its eerie trees whispering promises carried on the night breeze. The curse had been pushed back, but the darkness was never truly gone. It lurked, biding its time, eager to reclaim what it had lost. Breathless, Emily found herself on the ground, heart racing, surrounded by the remnants of her fight. The light flickered weakly now, the lantern battling against the growing darkness encircling her. She knew this was only a temporary victory and that she would never be free. The shadows were a part of her now, carved deep into her soul, reminding her that the struggle was eternal, leaving scars that would never fully heal. As she rose, she looked around for any sign of hope, but the sun began to set, the vibrant colors twisting into shades of fire and anguish. The trees stood tall and silent, shadows merging around her. She walked forward, feeling both lost and scattered, each step echoing the toll of her choices. Then, a soft rustle in the underbrush drew her attention. She turned to the sound, heart pounding, as the familiar voice echoed once more, chilling her to the core. "You've come back. Join us, Emily." The shadows twisted and writhed, forming new shapes, eager faces of those she had encountered before, eager to welcome her into their fold once more. With a deep breath, she turned into the fading light, knowing that the true battle was far from over. She felt the darkness in her core, whispering, urging, promising a twisted kind of peace. The choice was clearer now in a world where shadows lay waiting, offering companionship in a way only the lost could understand. In that moment, she realized that the forest wouldn't let her leave so easily. It was woven into her destiny, forever binding her to its shadows. She was part of it now. Light or dark, this was where she belonged. And as the sun vanished, she took one last look around. A grin stretched across her face as the echoes of a forgotten laughing child stirred within her. A darkness that cradled her, whispering another story just beginning.